Hello everyone, today we talk about Roman warfare and more specifically of the characteristics of the Roman battle, mostly during the Republican and early Imperial period, around at least they can fit for this broader era. We have already looked at some Roman battles. Here and there we talked about Roman tactics, and the comparison between the Manipular legion with the Macedonian phalanx. We have made already some broader tactical analysis about Roman warfare, and especially I would say the Middle Republican one. Just the other day we were looking at the evolution of the Roman legion indirectly through the development of the same spear and javelin warfare in among the Italic peoples, and we have thus already outlined the essentials, right? As you know, I specialize in properly in the art of war and specifically in tactics as far as the Middle Ages are concerned. And while I've always been interested in ancient warfare, and of course wondered how the same things worked, right? And they did, as we will see, partially very similar ways after all. There is hardly, historiographically speaking, a similar attention towards this topic, right? There has been an hyper publicized attention towards the new military history, Kagan, the face of battle, all these kind of things that I personally loathe to very far extremes for reasons that we will not discuss today, but that are fundamentally inherent to the extremely selective, non-diachronic, non-comparative, and de facto art of war related methods, experience, background, specialization, etc. of the authors, right? You think to be immersed in a world where you can magically pick from so many different books and articles, etc., that will, unveil you the main fact features can be of a Roman battle. But as a matter of fact, there is hardly such a thing. I come from a school that has always focused on sources first, and you may be surprised to hear that this is not quite the case, especially in the most famous military historiography that privileges, first of all, scholarship in all its forms. So, in other words, the scholar's opinion is more important than the source per se. And many of you will say, well, of course, but the sources are not just the truth. Well, that's exactly the problem, right? Who did ever tell you that the sources were telling you the truth, or that everything that was written there is, correct and on which criteria do you assess personally this correctness? And very often scholarship fails dramatically, but not just, things like Connolly mistranslating Longke with Sarissa, right? Because he doesn't know ancient Greek, and everybody like morons copying him and having, in publishing even pictures of the Carthaginian army with Macedonian pikes. Here we're talking about, first of all, the fact that this is just per se a detailed consequence of a broader, massive, systemic, structural incompetence in what is thought to be, the successors of, the classical, effective historiography and properness and in method, in analysis, etc. Unfortunately, this is still a reality today, and given that I believe civilization will be shrinking, at least to some degree, academies are in crisis, we will enter in a phase that is similar somehow to the late medieval one, right? And humanistic Renaissance direction, that will make it worse in a way where we are already experiencing it through these shortcomings in the last decades, and that can be explained also through very interesting, even military historical, say, contemporary phases issues, right? The Vietnam War, for example, impacted dramatically the way not even just American historians, but sometimes I have approached combat. The proof of that is also key, and that fundamentally doesn't understand the nature of combat, in spite of, because he has never studied von Clausewitz. And for scholars to do things like teaching at West Point or Sandhurst is not literally, what it takes to be specifically competent about certain topics, especially when you monopolize the scene. You're fundamentally unchallenged, and you don't even properly see what you're doing sometimes, when, again, literally other academies are studying things in a bit more proper way, and that you need to look at comprehensively also throughout the various eras. And that's why I feel this, particularly as a medievalist who has always studied ancient warfare, and who, if he has developed some capacity in this field, it has to do with having studied different times in different places, and not just having focused on even just one of such context, but not even made a sort of weird brainstorming of the kind of, say, let's teach global history in a university class. That doesn't mean anything. That's also a waste of time, as a matter of fact. And it does really take to spend a lifetime just learning, right? And even there, you will realize how unsatisfactory that can be. So this is part of my broader criticism towards, the world, as you have understood by this point with these initial introductory rambles. But I think that these are, like, if we just pat on each other's shoulder and say, oh my god, yes, we after all know, you can check here, we can discuss, etc. But the question is, have we even set the standards here, which are not, the infinite. It's just, even, again, not making gross mistakes or approximations. Or, for example, as I see from all the overwhelming amount now of archaic Roman warfare publications that I accumulated, like, just circling around, not much because the sources are limited, and or because you can allegedly make some kind of cross subject, interdisciplinary approach, because literally you live in a bubble where if you study these topics, you don't even know what a 14th century army worked like. And if you did, you would understand much better also how a Roman legion fought on the field. In fact, it would be relatively surprising for some to hear that there is not much written about the overall characteristics of Roman combat, right? That, for example, political warfare has received an important degree of attention more comparatively. There are reasons that are inherent to the same classical historiographies, right? As we will see now, the Hellenists didn't write like the Romans, and in different times, in different places, things work differently. So you can't quite compare everything, or at least if you want to do it, you're doing it to highlight the difference over a broader base. That is, of course, the general pattern in this case of how humans behave in combat. That, again, today will not look at per se, but just looking at a broader picture of the legion in combat, and just as general features, right? But again, the only purpose of studying the art of war is to highlight its universal meaning, because otherwise, if you think that war changed, which didn't, right? There are things that change all the time in everything, but is there something that is more absolute, and that you can at least treat as the extreme of a spectrum within which certain things happen, and they happen in a certain way? Well, if you have followed my von Kriege series, you know that that's quite the case, and that's how I just methodologically and dialectically work and illustrate these things. In any case, Roman warfare is something I decided to get a bit more in depth to, given that, again, that series I made last month has attracted a great amount of interest, even though the topics were dramatically general, and now we're getting a bit more in the depths of it. And paradoxically, that's where people don't follow you more than much anymore, but could be a strategy, maybe just to know how to get more or less views. And I'm improving my awareness of that, but I care about history more than views. And so I want also to go with a certain degree of order. We will always intersperse some kind of more general video within the more detailed ones, but we need both because it's part of that aforementioned method. So today we will essentially look at this dynamics of Roman heavy infantry in battle, right? And so there are important time and space mechanics here. First of all, how long did battles last? What was the degree of losses, right? What was the lethality of this fight, the mortality as well? What did concretely happen on this battlefield? That is to say, how much did the various arrays move in order to engage with each other? And especially in the case of the Romans, because we will see partly, of course, also the enemies of Rome here. How did the Roman units interacted with one another? I can immediately say about the last aspect that we have already seen here and there, especially talking about I made videos about Roman tactics, about the Roman cohort. I don't remember now what we looked at. Of course, I made a video about archaic Roman combat. So of course we did necessarily pass through either from before or afterwards the problem manipular tactics, but we haven't, however, still discussed in thoroughly per se, and I can tell you actually manipular tactics is the ones I know better, and that I dedicated an important amount of time analyzing, and that I hope in fact to treat adequately on Schwerpunkt. It's a somehow non-problem, at least if you study these battles comparatively again through other times. You realize that the battle lines support in interaction is it's in part like a dark area, because we don't know exactly how it worked. This is also like a fundamental notion of anybody who has at least approached sources on Roman warfare. There are things that literally and are not known, right? I've found myself adult people back in the day in Facebook groups, etc., trying to say, okay, I have to research this aspect because we don't know yet. There are certain things that by definition there are not sources on. So that doesn't mean that you cannot, in fact, draw comparisons, analogies, and so on with other models, but and that's what partly, of course, we do now. But exactly for this, I tell you that it was not a specific Roman thing, right? It is true that the art of war evolves in certain ways, and that, of course, the thing of a single battle line, it evolves within the same Roman army that surely had important characteristics, as we've seen, politically, socially, culturally, for the system to work that way. But it was not like an extra gear that others didn't have just because, I don't know, the Romans deployed their troops in, I don't know, multiple lines, like in the Accius triplex in depth, just because there were Romans, and that was a win per se, right? You in warfare, you do not really fight the way you do because you have a genial idea that the others are too stupid not to have thought about before. You are able to do certain things only if you have a hell of an army, which means to be essentially morally loaded, and if just the enemy allows you, if the terrain allows you, if the situation, generally speaking, allows you to do this, which hardly does. And so even the way they were deployed corresponds to a broader logic that is not really, a matter of just free will per se, right? It's just we have seen this last autumn, for example, making that video about the Battle of Poitiers in 1356. That is one of the single most beautiful battles actually I've ever analyzed. And as you know, I have been rather vocal also about the 14th century, 15th century English tactics that again suffer a bit of the same mythologization, not understanding how strong those armies were, in spite of the fact that they weren't practically at all differing from the ones of their foes in many ways. And instead, no, it must be the longbow, it must be the tactics of the wings, it must be, let's test the penetration of the longbow on modern replicas. And people literally believe that this has anything to do with how, a battle like Poitiers was won by the Black Prince. This is hurtful, right, for a person who just loves the art of war, because it really tells you intimately, deeply, and evidently, by the way, that properly who approaches military history from that perspective doesn't truly know anything, right? Because if you don't start from the basics, you cannot literally even, speculate on things that just by scale are not as relevant as the bigger ones. And that's where most problems actually in all science and morals come from. That we think we start with, we are okay. No, we are not okay, right? Humans are not okay by definition, right? We are struggling to sort out the world exactly because we don't know what it's like. So you cannot start with a right foot ever, and that's how our entire learning process happens. Instead, you have been convinced that it's the other way around. And that's why people need to think thus that by making up the stories that they know and they're better, while they actually aren't, because again, we have completely lost any transcendental awareness, and as such we do not have standards that hold by any degree, nor morally nor scientifically. And not that these do not exist, right? This is valid in for any subject actually. So starting from time, right, the duration of battles, this, as we will see, are pretty plain topics, because it's not even about Rome, it's just normalizing the way we are approaching these topics, as if, but what about the time? Is it a big deal? Like, it can tell us something, and we can build theories and debate on this. We will see it better in other videos, but it's important to start from this aspect. So sometimes, just sometimes, Roman infantry clashes, given that the Roman army was essentially an infantry-based one, were decided sometimes, again, very rapidly, right? And there are instances in which one side gave way, not only just, soon, right, after the start of combat, but even before the first shock, right? Not necessarily contact, because, these armies were, entering battle comforted by an important degree of skirmishing that was also necessary to provide the necessary time for lining up and just, more or less making commanders aware of what the situation was. That's another thing we will not look at today, because we look mostly at legionary combat in the core heavy infantry dimension. So, not that the Romans, as we haven't seen just in the other video about the 4th century, that the Livian legion, probably at the end of the 4th century BC is concerned, didn't have javeliners or skirmishers on their own, but fundamentally light infantry doesn't decide the engagement. We could talk about cavalry as well, and partly, in fact we will, but it's also not today's focus, but we will do it as well. We know from Livy that the instance of Roman troops giving way. The first clashes, right, occurred on the Battle of the Allia River at Erdonia during the Second Punic War. So in context that, of course, today we will not look at in detail, but if you know how the Allia River battle went, for example, you know that at this time the Romans still had a single battle line, a bit like the phalanx, albeit again there was nothing like an hoplitic phalanx in Italian warfare, not even, as a matter of fact, in the way we intend the Athenian as part of one, even in the Hellenic colonies of southern Italy. That this is another thing. But you know that basically the Gauls managed to overrun a Roman position on the flank and to just fall on the single line and to make it crumble, right? And that's how the Romans eventually probably came up with the idea, the necessity actually to increase the depth of the formation, to separate the various battle lines from a big deep one. An issue that will go on for instead other peoples, including ones that would be defeated by the Roman tribal line, such as the Macedons, right? But here we also have to distinguish a bit which kind of arms interaction we're discussing, because, as you know, the Macedonian tactics were fundamentally the gold standard up to the Second Punic War, when the Carthaginians literally bring it beyond at Cannae, after which somebody arrived to say that nothing really in the art of war was added conceptually after that. So a perfect synergy of all the arms, right? Not just like hammer and anvil, like Philip II and Alexander III had basically achieved, but something more comprehensive that in fact the same Romans learn from Hannibal and are able actually to use to defeat the same Carthaginians, de facto for good, because the Third Punic War was more like finishing off something that was already significantly crippled. There are instances, of course, also of enemies of Rome having essentially given way at this first shocks, such as at the Battle of Ibera and the Battle of Acragas, right, still in the Punic Wars context. And as we have explained many times, there isn't, in essence, much of a deep difference between essentially heavy infantry in the Mediterranean and in Europe throughout this period, right? The emblematic example of this is how the same Hellenes called the heavy infantry of any other people: Celts, Romans, Carthaginians. For a Greek, they were all fighting with a phalanx, which etymologically is just like a rolling tree log, right? And you know that Hellenic hoplites and eventually Macedonian phalangites fought in very different way, apparently, in terms of properly unit dynamics, interaction with other arms, than the Celts, the Romans, or the Carthaginians. But at the end of the day, when you look at the broader decisiveness of battles, not only you realize that these were settled by major movements with various chunks that surely were allowed to do so more or less because of certain characteristics that mostly infantry had, but that when it came to combat, like you don't really have like fist, scissor, or paper on the base of whether we're talking again a phalangite or a legionnaire or a Celtic warrior. There is essentially an essential consubstantiality, to use a theological comparison, with heavy infantry per se, because otherwise they would have not even taken the field at that point. You would have done something like the Numidians did, just light troops skirmishing, and that's pretty much it, right? Instead, if you go out there in a pitched battle wherever you are, you must have heavy infantry. And even though we don't have any evidence, for example, of a Macedonian infantry being broken frontally, if not by itself, meaning on the ground, whatever, for accidents fundamentally, and that's really the thing. Still, you see, well, in that case, I don't know, Roman legionnaires, but also other types of troops taking them on frontally, and just knowing that in order to defeat that formation, they had to fight, symmetrically as they did on the battlefields, frontally. And that was the way to go. Then if some other accident occurred, like this line splitting in two chunks and one going ahead and the other being outflanked because of the space that had formed, not gaps. I made a video specifically explaining how, especially the gaps between the various units are first of all always exist in any single formation, even the phalangitic one, but they're not enough to be exploited by much larger units, right? You can exploit a gap only if this gap is something like, I don't know, 500 meters, right? So it's a completely different, because there are lots of people say, the Romans were able to defeat the Macedonian phalanges because they could pour into the gaps between the units. Bullshit. There is not a single evidence of that. If you're talking about Pydna, read the sources and realize what that is. That is the entire phalanx breaking by itself on the terrain, and thus unitly, losing cohesion, but not absolutely, the Romans fighting in the gaps of the natural gaps that every battle line has per se, just to avoid disorder. That is not witnessed by any source of any period, because simply it does not exist, it does not work. It's not a functional thing to do. You lose in doing so, right? You lose your own cohesion to get into a narrow path between two units. What for? How do you think actually combat dynamics happen? What do you think moral force stands when you get, basically in a dysfunctional sense as a monad within two blocks that are conceived to just be functional in collective, superiority by themselves? It has no military logic of any kind, and it's not what happened, even in the Roman victories over the Macedonian phalanxes. And even the thing of the court maniple, it's more a global difference than a small unit tactics than you think, again. But in this mechanistic, deterministic, teleologistic, etc., positivistic view that we partly also inherited from a bit the abstract conceptualizations, even of names that are supposedly considered as military expert, like Polybius himself, that really we don't have that. Okay, we're getting very very far here, but I have discussed this in the aforementioned video. What I mean is that they have practically nothing to do with how battles were decided, right? And the more you enter that cul-de-sac, the worse you perform in terms of any military understanding, and people know this, can easily spot you, right? So you don't make any, if you're searching for sympathies or something, that's not how it works successfully, right? So I realize there are a lot of ignorant people out there that will believe any bullshit that you tell them, such as the Romans were winning because they had more flexibility, and then can you explain this on the basis of sources? No, of course, because you haven't even read them, or even if you had read them, you cannot translate them correctly from the original languages. So it's as if you're just, let's be honest about this, you're just copying what you heard somebody else is saying without actually understanding what it meant. It's totally relatable because we all learn, but that's where things should be treated more carefully, because normally a scholar will not tell you this straight in the face, so you have the opportunity at least of listening to me telling you that that's the actual deal. So good manners, of course, I also behave in a more tolerant way often, not so often, actually even on public occasions, but that's just because we are here to learn. And if you're polite, of course, you deserve an explanation. If we are in the West, those who have to provide with one, but just making videos on YouTube, I can tell you how it is uh, beyond the etiquette, let's say. Some scholars have argued that such quickly won engagements in interest of time were more frequent in periods like the late Republic and early imperial times. Mm, this is debatable, as a matter of fact, but I promise we will make a video about this too, because when it comes to stats, it's always very complicated. You should, in my opinion, it's mostly a matter of how, of course, Roman historiography told the story as opposed to others, right? Because again, Caesar is not Polybius, and you have to spot the differences. You have to spot the difference in properly, who was writing and when, how, what were the literary models, and you can easily get tricked, right? If you just kind of shop these quotes from sources like at a supermarket and pretending to make a mathematical statistics out of that. Well, it's not really going to end well either. In any case, in fact, what we see more clearly is that the average is hours-long battles, right? It may be that I don't know, the Romans during the civil wars of the late so-called Republic were, say, more aware of each other to understand, how an engagement could be settled. Could be that in early imperial times, especially against the peoples that Rome clashed against, so like Central Europeans or the Jews, etc. It was an easier game, right? But even at that point, I don't think there is an actual convincing stats that tells us that there was a concentration of earlier settled engagements in that period of Roman history compared to other times. I don't. I think as a military historian that first of all, we don't know about most of warfare. This is something, especially as a medievalist, is very clear to me, that in Middle Ages we can track most of what is the surrounding of a pitched battle, with news of hundreds of engagements that were sometimes even smaller pitched battles that we simply didn't decide to consider historiographically as such, while classical historiography was much more, absolute in focus and looked at the bigger thing and sometimes overshadows the smaller engagements. So again, it's a falsified perspective. What is clear instead is that normally battles lasted hours. Livy is an interesting pool of information regarding this. There are lots of battles he describes lasting several hours. Plutarch says that Pydna was decided unusually speedily in just 1 hour. That, yes, also considering the forces involved, is few, and I discussed Pydna in the aforementioned video comparison between the Manipular Legion and the Macedonian phalanx, and it was kind of an exception in many ways. As in war, exceptions always happen, but also there with a pattern. And Pydna is not particularly representative of what a favorably employed, let's put it in this way, Macedonian phalanx really worked like, right? It doesn't mean that there wasn't something wrong. However, with the system, once those in fact circumstances were not met with, so that's sure they can surely talk about also theoretical weakness, but there we have lots of issues regarding also the very details of this battle that is told to us also in very positivistic terms, right, by the sources that were already toying with the mechanism essentially Hellenistic historiography had consolidated. And if a Roman if we had a contemporary Roman account, the story would have been perhaps even more vague and more concentrated on valor, on moral forces and such things, but we would perhaps have indirectly grasp kind of some better picture, because it's normal. Like, it happens to me also in the Middle Ages. So you see, this battle was, solved quite quickly, and then you have another source says, they fought for a good while, and it doesn't tell you precisely how much, but you understand just that if you hear a source, it doesn't matter that's all what exists, or that you should take, in fact, that source as the official, standard, objective one to decide simply on that statement what actually occurred. That's why comparative perspective is crucial. But you have always to listen to what the source says, because everything that is said is hardly an invention per se. It's just said in ways that have to make sense, and that's that logic that was in the author's head. Sometimes without even understanding too much about military affairs, it was eventually based on what he had been told, even by, people who had fought in that battle, but that not necessarily was explained, even just in the way we would have liked to know. Because consider again that these sources were written for a specific audience for specific purposes. If one doesn't even focus on that has nothing to do very often, or partly even so, with indirectly, at least with the military side of the story. It's a bit complicated just to claim on the basis of that. But Justice claims that battles were usually resolved in 2 or 3 hours. And we are in later times, as you understand. One may suspect, of course, that not only the information is vague per se, because even when you reconstruct a battle, normally the informations about time come just at the end of the main body on the battle that is much larger, and most of the times it literally, the battle lasted this amount, right, or even just a rough amount. And the example we made before about even just this battle lasted 1 hour, which is unusual, is just episodic in the entire ancient literature, right? And so you cannot even properly take it in a statistical sense. But there is a broader point, that is to say, what was the time calculated here about? Was it just the actual engagement, like between the heavy infantries, that, as we know, as we will see also better in other videos, wasn't at all like a continuous melee, but basically, just a few minutes engagements, scattered across hours, right? Because there is no other way to fight, as a matter of fact, before this could get down to a solution. And what about the preliminary phases, the skirmishing, the other maneuvers that were happening sometimes even in different parts of the battlefield? We're not told, of course, right? Caesar makes very clear in his account of Ilerda in the Civil War that an isolated contest between several cohorts of legionnaires could indeed last as long as 5 hours. And you understand that also from the losses, it was not even particularly bloody engagement sometimes. So literally they were spending time just testing each other before even coming, to cold steel, and solving the matter just in melee at close quarters. So that's literally what we stand on. There is an important distinction to make also between the sources that talk about, say, the Middle Republic, such as Polybius, who are Greeks, talking about the Romans. There are also other, Diodorus, Carnaxus. There are other, of course, Greeks that, as you understand, are writing essentially as a Roman subjects at that point, but that think like Greeks. That is a very different way from which a Roman did, and you can definitely appreciate it in especially the 1st century BC literature. In fact, like Caesar, Livius, etc. That of course, represents a essentially the product of our Roman oligarchic literature used for different aims, right? For different audiences and so on. You must understand that, but it is coming from a Roman mindset that is much more concerned with not with mechanistic positivistic explanations, but with concepts of, again, moral force, valor, and therefore telling the story a bit more like a saga rather than, again, what happened dynamically on the battlefield in some just of formations, right? Sometimes you do find this schemes, but they are still focusing on, at the end of the day, who had it, right, in terms of valor, bravery, but also discipline, especially the virtue that we were talking about yesterday. So it's still a different mindset, also because it's a different society. We will see this better now, comparing some of these data with the ones about the classical Hellenic warfare, not the Hellenistic one, because surprise, surprise, we know much better about the 5th century hoplite than the 4th century phalangite. Guess why? Because they were completely different people, right? The first ones were literally writing as citizens fighting in the phalanx, and the latter were just proletarians hired by a feudal monarchy. This had nothing, they wouldn't even know how to write or care how to write in the first place. And a bit the same is for the Romans, because you don't find a legionnaire talking about this. You can have people from a bit slightly different social strata, but fundamentally it's the senators that write, right? And so with a very specific mindset in a very specific society that is also different from the Hellenistic one, and so on. So there is another way to assess more or less how long these battles lasted on the base of the maneuvers going on within the same battle. So in a sort of bigger tactical picture. For example, the Carthaginian cavalry of Hannibal at Cannae to beat the Roman one, right? So to ride around to the other wing to see off the Italian one, and then to take the Roman infantry in the rear, which is one of the greatest feats of cavalry, just collective training that was augmented also through of course, military experience, but through the hard discipline that Hannibal was imposing for carrying out this extraordinary system. Because, as you know, at Cannae, some elements were literally barbaric and were used in part to do what they were doing better, but also to perform some feats that in their warfare are not to be found autonomously. But many people don't get this aspect, like the level of training that it takes to perform 3 cavalry charges, so regrouping each time in between them to reform is enormous, right? You exhaust a unit, right? Normally, 1 engagement, 2, that's the average, right? At most 3 really tells you that there is something there that is nothing short of incredible. Naturally, even about this, it's Polybius telling the story. We don't know too much about the details, but the military logic is coherent with the account, and we have to deduce that was quite the case. And as I understand, it takes time also to do all this, not just the engagement, but again the reforming, and all this while a battle is going on. The same goes for the brilliant maneuver of Nero at the Battle of the Metaurus River, when the Romans moved their infantry from the right wing round the back of their own army, left to assail the Carthaginian right from the behind, which was a masterpiece, actually even predating Scipio's maneuvers that is not to be underestimated to see how much potential and maturity there was already in the manipular legion, right? That is something that also evolves over time. It's not always the same thing throughout the 4th and the 3rd century BC, nor during the 2nd. There are interesting considerations to make, even in fact regarding the specific experience maturity in wars such as the 2nd Punic one, but was enormous. We can see the same time it takes for Labienus at the Battle of the River Sabis in 57 BC against the Belgians, in order to beat the Atrebates and the Viromandui, then going on to seize the Gallic camp, and then sending the 10th Legion back to relieve Caesar's hard-pressed forces on the river. It just spatially speaking, we don't know exactly all the distances involved, but as you understand it, it's remarkable maneuver even here that could be performed just by top units in terms of collective training, moral force, physical fitness, and so on, in a dramatically balanced way. This was a battle that, as you know, witnessed a ferocious Belgian furor charge uphill in a terrifying way that Caesar, was very impressed by, because it seemed, as we were saying in the other days, what a Celtic warrior was able to do was individually, but also how, eventually it was this broader collective training and discipline incarnated by the Roman legionnaires that got the thing done, really. And this all requires judgment, requires orders being passed along the line. It's complex, right? It doesn't happen immediately or suddenly, or even in a pre-arranged fashion, because at some point you have to autonomously decide what you're going to do in some ways, and that's why certain commanders are also so provided with autonomy, because that's a necessity given the judgment required to take some decisions in unpredictable affairs, right? And consider that in the aforementioned examples, during such extensive maneuvers, there was a main engagement between heavy infantry, face to face, raging throughout, and in great part of the field, so also the space. So all this is still paralleling a continuous combat, or at least confrontation between the heavy infantries involved. There is something apparently odd about the fact that we actually know more about battle duration for Roman warfare than the classical Hellenic one, right? The latter, of course, occurred in a older time, about which we also know very few about Roman warfare in that degree of detail. And probably from an Hellenic perspective, it was a bit idealistic and not really looking at things like how long does a battle last, which instead in a Roman practical mentality seemed kind of probably more important. We, of course, have information about battles lasting a long time in classical political warfare, but the exact measures are quite not there. And another crucial factor is that the aforementioned maneuver calculation is not as much possible as for the Roman battles, were more dynamic than the Hoplitic ones, where essentially the phalanx just remained what it was. And even though things, yes, could go astray, because there is never like just the perfect full frontal clash between just two phalanxes, and one breaks, and so it's it. It's somehow simpler than these, in fact, more autonomous, dynamic, and also, frankly, aggressive Roman battles. We can see, of course, some similar movements that we can think having lasted a while, such as wheeling around against the enemy after having broken a chunk of the phalanx. We see it at the Battle of Mantinea of Nemea, the second Battle of Chaeronea. So Thucydides, Xenophon, etc. Do tell us, as you know, an important amount of things. But the time data is somehow less precise, which helps us actually reconstructing Roman battles, in spite of the less kind of mechanistic historiography that, especially for the late Republic and the early Empire, is looking at. It would be fair actually to point out that we have much greater information, of course mainly thanks to the Greeks, about Roman warfare while they were describing it. Also, as we've seen, Roman times, while these authors were living under Rome, then actually the early Empire, like you would think that the apparent pinnacle of Roman military capabilities was also kind of the better documented as far as historiography is concerned. We know much more from an archaeological point of view, because at that point Rome stretched far and wide for a long time, and it had just like the best material culture available. But we know actually less, right? And part of the reason is, of course, that the system is feudalizing further, so you find actually less attention. Even in the Hellenistic world, you depart from that somehow, still lower than it was, at least at the time, class perspective that could even nurture kind of more analytical approach to things. Even people that just participated toward that's very important. Xenophon is a mercenary and a great military expert who directly saw what he did. Even if you start from Polybius, that is normally credited with having had a military curriculum, having been sent as a cavalry instructor in Egypt and all this stuff. First of all, he never actually saw a Macedonian phalanx against a Roman legion in battle, and as you know, he actually expresses his own opinions about that. Even if you read translated, you can easily understand it wasn't for the same ancient Greek expressions he uses, that he had not quite really seen the thing. He was just not making that up, but trying, again, to rationalize, to provide with a positive explanation, making it too simple, to make the long story short, paradoxically. Really wasn't, because he belonged already to a much more oligarchic system that wrote mostly for, again, a political reason. And that's part of the reason why also Roman warfare is described like that. And we don't have, the account of a centurion for Roman warfare to tell us how the lower things really worked, right? We just have to rely on simply what our knowledge about the military hierarchy really was about, but we don't have those voices. We can understand a lot from other things, from tomes, from, generally speaking, some other information on the life of these people, and their equipment and so on. But it's a different story, really. There have been studies about the average losses in percentage during hoplitic battles. And the conclusion is more or less, again, depending on the battle, but overall, something like 5% casualties on the victor's side, and only, objectively, 14% on that of the defeated. Where we're talking about the percentage, of course, on the absolute strength of the forces in battle, right? casualties among the losers in Roman battles were frequently instead far heavier, right? With over half of the defeated army often being either killed or taken prisoner. This is particularly interesting because, of course, we rely fundamentally on just the sources of the time. Polybius tells us that the Carthaginians at Zama suffered 20,000 dead and almost as many captured, only a few escaping. At the Battle of Kynoskephali, 8,000 Macedonians were killed and 5,000 taken prisoners out of Philip V's 25,500 strong army, right? And this is also what Polybius and Livy say. Again, I will not enter in the literary questions like, on which philologically sources did they rely on, because some were, it depended also, these were differently distant events in time from the same authors that could rely on just some stories, traditions, witnesses, and so on, but we don't know practically anything of that. We can have more or less an idea, and sometimes we can appreciate whether, they could have easily met with people who had been there that day, but we literally don't know also. Now, could the Roman or the Romanophile historiography increase willingly the amount of enemy losses, right? The question is perhaps, as of course none of these numbers are perfect, like we hardly get like the precise number in, but as a matter of fact, the amount of losses from the side of the victors are actually similar to the ones of political battles, right? And there is one major factor to consider that makes it actually very plausible to have had such a greater mortality among the defeated by the Romans. And bear in mind, here in the aforementioned count, we have just seen properly the Hoplitic fights, not say the Hellenistic ones. And one is obvious, that is the presence of cavalry, right? And the possibility of pursuing the enemy, right? An Hoplitic phalanx could break the enemy one, but then in order to maintain cohesion, which as also the Battle of Marathon actually shows, was crucial, even while pursuing a fleeing enemy that could still somehow resist and inflict heavy losses, as they were individually better warriors, like the Achaemenids were, was crucial. So an enemy hoplite, when the phalanx was broken, and thus that symmetry on the base of which you could hope to shift the balance was lost forever, you would throw just your heavy equipment and run, right? And given that in Hoplitic warfare there wasn't so much cavalry, even though there actually was, and exactly for the purpose of chasing the enemy, so much that some poleis agreed on saying, we should fix the battle like this, and we shouldn't chase up to a certain line. They literally made things like this because among, again, saying Greeks, they behaved partially in a more, let's say, mediated way. Of course, battles against foreigners were kind of, you hate these people more, generally speaking, and or you have less connections with them, so it's easier to kill them in many ways. But at the same time, again, cavalry was unhinged, also in the same Hellenic world after Hellenistic times, so much that, Hellas was hegemonized by Macedonia per se. But properly cavalry is brought in consistent numbers, and losses increase brutally, of course. In even you can see it during the Peloponnesian War, the introduction of different tactics, even probably to kill hoplites. Think about pelt tests, etc. Yes, it's light infantry, so we're not talking about that specifically, and it's not even just in pitched battles. But still, there is a more composite arms cooperation that, of course, increases the effectiveness and thus also the power delivered, and increase the losses. It was normal, generally speaking, in this battles to have a relatively few casualties during the fight. This time it's not even so true. For example, people say, I don't know, the Macedonian warfare was just, after not so much bloody, the phalanx didn't almost even fight, they poked at each other with the Sarissai, and most of the casualties were later. Well, the latter aspect, of course, is true because the majority of casualties was later. But if you look at battles like, I don't know, the one of Raphia, there were some thousands of losses from both sides during combat, which is a lot. Doesn't matter how large these armies were, still we're talking about like 1/10 of the entire losses of the entire army, and it's not few at all, right? The same can be said actually for some Roman battles, as we will see now. And interestingly enough, about battles between the Macedonians, or at least in that case, the Epirotes and Rome, right? But of course, there is something about classical Hellenic politic warfare that is particularly agonistic by some regard. Who has symbolically established that he is the stronger one. It just could really do a lot within that political system, right, against a rival city. Romans essentially grabbing and conquering and subduing properly all the surrounding peoples was something actually much more brutal and violent, and probably also breaking much of those conventions that had been locally established by some degree. I mean, not that, again, Macedonian warfare was that particularly gentle at all. There were some of the most radically, brutally violent thing you can ever imagine. But the point is that still there is this idea, in fact, that the Romans were still half barbarians, even just in a Macedonian eye, and they would be up to that appreciation, let's say, plus, however, as Pyrrhus realized that these were maybe, yes, they were something else, but they also knew how to make war in pretty modern terms, or some that really had a lot of discipline involved, and that's what that was really also the worst for those from the other side. And we definitely see this taste for blood, decapitations, massacres, etc. Even think about the Macedonian warriors chopped to pieces by the gladi at Pydna. We know how, like, plain butchery this really practically was, and the Romans were pretty exalted about this. Of course, this could happen to them, such as at Cannae, when they were literally encircled, but at that point incapable of flight, because at that point that's the importance of the moral forces. You realize you're done for. So yes, sometimes you can fight to the death, but sometimes you're just knowing it's lost anyway, and that has devastating consequences. But if you look at the aftermath of Pydna and the defeat of Ariovistus, you realize there that the Macedonians and the Suebi were mercilessly slaughtered from behind by faster enemy cavalry. And the sources are pretty clear about this, not just in the historiographical accounts, but also in the Roman, quite equestrian-minded ideology, in sculptural depictions with Roman horsemen riding down defeated foes, right, properly crushed under the weight of the Roman military, and that have to do with properly, even just graphically, the moment just after the enemy ranks had been broken and these enemies were just just running and thus defenseless because they were not in a formation anymore. They were just like slaughtered like animals. What is more interesting to examine, of course, is the rate of losses, as we were saying before, suffered by the victors. So as we were saying before, losses could be severe, right? Properly, the concept of Pyrrhic victory that is brought about by Plutarch is referred naturally to the epiheroes mostly, but you know that in those battles, the Romans suffered pretty high losses themselves, and yet they were kind of rare occasions. There is a kind of evolution in the art of war for which, for example, in fact, the Pyrrhic wars are quite interesting because you have from one side as a very stubborn, primitive, and brutal Romano-Italic confederacy against a dramatically advanced, superbly led, and very very tough Hellenistic army, and that is the outcome. Like a massive bath of blood from both sides. So much that Pyrrhus said, "My God, that will list this to the historiography. We could make a video about him. That, of course, another victory like this, and I'm done for, right?" And consider that the Romans, of course, would win the war, and the Italian peninsula wasn't the only theater that Pyrrhus was interested in, but fundamentally should have been the starting point for essentially retaking everything that had been Alexander's in the east. And so we're in that case we discussed in the video about the Manipur Legion and the Macedonian phalanx. There are also pretty interesting adaptations tactically to such enormous problem, because again, warfare is mostly about how much you want to rip to pieces the person in front of you, and not much what you have in your hands, right? So again, moral forces are brutally supreme in relative terms, and this is well exemplified by those kind of wars. When you look at the Macedonian wars, I mean Rome versus the Antigonians, you see something else, because the Romans, before setting foot in Greece, were still kind of, these are the heirs of Alexander. Yes, we defeated Pyrrhus, or at least we forced him out, but tactically speaking, if we have to engage this in yet another pitch battle, we could, it could be rough, right? And nobody did think about this, morally speaking, nobody had ever proven to be stronger than the Macedonian phalanx at that point. The Romans, as you know, collection an important amount of victories against the Macedonians. But there you realize that, at least for how the story is told to us, as we were saying before, that these Macedonian armies, talk about the Antigonians, but also the Seleucids, as you know, crumbled for reasons that apparently was, perhaps from an Hellenic perspective, like the Polybian one, saying, well, it is partly embraced also by the later Roman historiography. Like, the Greeks lost because they, this thing specifically went wrong. It doesn't tell you exactly how, from the Roman side, this thing went, right? It just tells you what the Greeks did wrong, what happened in the phalanx that didn't work correctly, and then they lost. Which is a very interesting way of trying to explain why a system had so great, like Alexander's one, had been crushed by these Italic barbarians. And the Romans themselves were the ones propagandating such concept, the fact that they were the brutal ones that, however, had surpassed even the masters, having learned from them. And so we have a bit adopted from both sides this kind of narrative, but we would probably be surprised by how balanced the odds really were, and how there was probably this moral dimension that made an important difference. Because banally, the Romans were, again, essentially always an oligarchy. So even as far as they could stress the the power of the Italic people per se. Just they weren't always celebrating the average legionnaire per se, but there was a lot there that they had learned the hard way by, in fact, trying to transform the Italic warrior in such Roman legionnaire that that was quite the right balance, as we were saying today, between the virtus and the discipline, and that really made a lot also in terms of the allies. For example, as Peter Knight says at some point, actually an Italic horde was routed by part of the Macedonian army. We can't know exactly what's behind this, whether these are more like anecdotes or judgments, how politically influenced they are. What of course stands out is that, however, the Roman losses against the Macedonian phalanx were particularly low, right? And this is perhaps correct, right? Because it may have well been that the Macedonian phalanx did, after all, screw up for reasons that very often had not much to do with the fact they were a phalanx, which is something that I highlighted, given that I studied in detail from all the sources, each and every one of the 7 battles in which the Romans engaged with that, and I explained it in the aforementioned video. It could have happened to the Romans as well, right? So they don't prove much in terms of mechanistically speaking or positivistically speaking, right? In any case, we know that the Romans, and here I insert also other battles among the same Romans that prove, however, that the losses of the victors did tend apparently to be particularly low, that the Romans suffered 700 dead at Kynoskephalae, 350 at Magnesia, 100 at Pydna, 230 at Pharsalus, and 1,000 at Munda. Right, the latter not being even particularly low, telling the truth, but consider that there Caesar was fighting against Pompey's veterans, right? So not guys you want to kid with, and that would give up so easily. So I think it's fair to assess that, generally speaking, also comparatively with other eras, that yes, victors normally suffered pretty modest losses after all. It's rare to find, even in more recent historiography, like when you have multiple sources, like one source says, we're just 100 dead, and the other says, oh my god, the site suffered so much losses. You can find it if it's not specified, like saying, 100 dead is, after all, they're still dead people, right? And the fact of killing, and it's always something impactful, so you can point that out. But in terms properly of quantities, there isn't much discrepancy, and I think that even the classical sources are fairly objective, after all. The asymmetry is clear, right? The defeated, especially against peoples like Romans, suffered a disproportionate amount of casualties compared to the Romans. If you even follow the logic of the battle, again, it's clear, right? If there is an entire army front that collapses, like it can be a Macedonian phalanx or another Roman legion, and you have cavalry to pursue, of course, it's logical. In fact, the point being that in actual combat, the two hosts would suffer a limited amount of losses. We know this also from other type of warfare. We've seen it even just for the Hellenic world, the Hellenistic world. But the greater amount was later, notoriously enough, right? And the obvious reason being that, for example, the wounded also were left behind in that way, and just cavalry could simply run against, again, something that was not an army anymore, but just individuals that are running away, right, and can't really properly resist. And what we in fact don't realize is how terrifying, how morally traumatic, and that can easily kill you, even just out of properly an internal collapse. Being defeated in battle really is. Right? We know people who literally died because of a syncope. They sometimes also the environmental side of the story was terrifying. People died of literally of lack of liquids during the battle, in the under the heat, the constant breathing, and the cost and the dust, etc. We know some people collapsed, like even young, strong males that would just go like that, and it's completely normal because the impact of seeing your entire forces shattered, knowing that that is coming for you quite soon, is just enough sometimes. And this death would arrive in the most terrifying way, as you understand. Um, that's why at Cannae, as we were saying before, the Romans seemingly got massacred themselves without essentially even putting up much of a fight. Right? One thing is bottling an enemy in a position when they can't think that they're in trap. Either they win or lose, but at least if they are, they still have a chance to repel the enemy. That they tried. One thing is being surrounded, and so you know that you have no way, because in battle, like you can. The reason why battles are fought symmetrically the way they are in our race is that in the moment in which you are outflanked, you're done for. Right, so there isn't much from a psychological point of view. It's so impacting that there is no such thing like the hero that is surrounded fights to the death, just in large numbers. Right, like it happened in Cannae. It does happen that pockets do that. There is always in retreats, etc., somebody who remains behind to allow the others to escape and literally fights to the death. This practically happens all the time. But being properly taken by surprise, like in the masterpiece of Cannae, that is at the top of everything, practically in the art of war, it's a wholly different matter as far as properly the moral impact of this whole thing really is, right? So at that point, you're already dead, right? And you hope that this is going to come as quickly as possible rather than anything else. Naturally, even for this, we don't have a video footage of it, so we don't know how it really went, but it's consistent with what we know about warfare in general. And of course we know from Plutarch, Caesar, etc., that there were some men who stood their ground too, and that got heroically massacred. So it's completely normal, as we were just saying. There are cases also in which the intensity of warfare is a bit dictated in numbers. For example, there is a 5-hour clash at the Battle of Ilerda in which Caesar's corps are said to have suffered 70 dead and 600 wounded, compared to the 200 killed and the unspecified number of wounded on the Pompeian side, according to the same Civil War of Caesar 1.46. This may depend simply, of course, on the toughness of the troops, why they're there, how motivated they are, and you understand that for a 5 hours engagement, this is not like a huge amount of dead, but we should see further how the combat would properly take place, because it could be hours, but again, the combat could have been quite limited in time, easily, right? And maybe just not even all one at a time, but suffering losses even just from missiles. We've seen the role of the Pila in the process, that were probably thrown not just during the resolutive charge, let's say, but also for most of the time while the battle was going on. We have from Flavius Josephus on the Jewish war a clash which went on all day when the Jews sailed forth from Iotapata, and here, like in an entire day of engagement, we have 13 Roman dead with many wounded, compared to 17 Jews killed and 600 wounded. Whatever the balance in individual cases, it's obvious that the result of combat, just for the way warfare is properly designed to work, is incompatible with a frequent slaughter from the side of the winner, right? And it's about shifting the balance and then exterminating. Right? And that comparatively, Roman battles were much bloodier than the classical hoplitic ones, mainly because of the Roman capacity to pursue the enemy. Right? The cavalry in here was crucial, but we should separate there also kind of the heavy shock cavalry from the lighter one. This is true also for the legionnaires. As a matter of fact, the legionnaire was much more, as we've seen, dualistic-minded than a hoplite. So, of course, the enemy could be pursued in many ways, right? If you really hate somebody's guts, you know that even it's mostly lighter troops, not the ones who have, suffered the brunt of the fight. That is, heavy infantry is also properly more exhausted and heavier just to move on the field to pursue. But you can find this happening properly, and starting from the moment the enemy starts fleeing, in a way. The flight actually starts from the posterior ranks rather than the frontal ones. But of course, in particularly messed up situations, think about Pydna, when the phalanx broke by itself and the Romans start charging in these spaces. Fundamentally, you have a pretty disorderly picture, and the directions also from which the enemy could arrive, sometimes from the flank, could actually be the greatest problem, because the enemy starts fleeing all from one side. I don't know, they also reverse themselves into a nearby river, whatever, and they drown. These things happen again throughout all military history, and we know how sometimes, as we were saying before, properly people die or they are helpless in these moments. That is to say, like having a mental shock for which you cannot recover, and you just stay there while you're being slaughtered. It literally happens. You just give up, or you can't react, and you stay there, and you're done for. And these peoples cared extremely about this moment, because it was the moment literally in which the Imperium manifested itself the most. And so exactly the moment in which you had to pursue the most and slaughter the most, as many people as you could. So, as we were saying before, there is a huge talk about how did the Roman battle lines interact with one another, right? And we know pretty well that during combat, infantry formations could give ground, right? Sometimes by deliberate choice or the irresistible enemy pressure. In many ways, it's the same, because if you're pushing back, you could do it sometimes because, again, you want to change the line, you're exhausted. This can happen, and as we've seen, there are enough there is enough time during a combat and another to take that decision and retreating if necessary. Other times you just are fighting and the enemy pushes you back. You see that the enemies are attacking, you instinctively pull back because you say, well, let's make them, if we can, bend in this way, and then, but you're still giving ground. So mentally, it's actually having given up the initiative and given an advantage to the enemy to dictate the fight, for where in a position it would hopefully be better for you, but that is basically altering. It's basically falling back, so it's morally crushed, and it's not taking on the initiative. That is the positive way of war, right? It requires more forces, but exactly for that, if you cannot resume it, it means that you are the weaker side. All this not necessarily fleeing. Maybe the battle line kind of started falling back, and that eventually would break. But there are two different dynamics. Now, this is a huge topic today we cannot just address per se, because we have um, so many questions of how this would actually happen. At Cannae, for example, the Carthaginian center was transformed from a convex into a concave formation under the Roman onslaught, allegedly on purpose, but you may never tell, just as for feigned flights, whether those were feigned or not, right? What is exceptional is how Hannibal had expected this and calibrated and calculated the whole thing, right, for the other elements of the army to interact functionally with it. And it was a way also to trade time, not just to suck the enemy into this trap, right? We have seen it, how at Kynoscephalae and Pydna, the Romans actually had a tough time at different times of the battle. At Kynoscephalae, they had practically almost been pushed back to defeat by troops that weren't even necessarily the enemy phalanx, as a matter of fact. And so they're thinking that kind of structuralistic, crystallized way. This is, again, war is a primarily clash between moral forces. So whether those were Agranian mountaineers or Macedonian phalangites in different times, it is important from a military point of view. But and the main body was, yes, the phalanx, even in that case. But sometimes we don't even know. And does it matter altogether? Because the troops give each other's confidence. The whole point of morale is that it's not like an individual soldier just, having its own separate morale, and it's the entire formation, of course. And at Pydna, as we've seen, the Macedons had managed even to rout some Italic horde, and were advancing on terrain which brought to its break, allegedly. Polybius, in his resume about the comparison between the Manipular Legion and the pikeman phalanx, says that the latter is vulnerable to these essentially phases of back and forth compared to the Roman forces. This is correct, generally speaking, because the Romans could more easily reform, even in what they call a globum, right? Kynoscephalae was evident. Even at Pydna, they broke into tinier formations. So, as primarily swordsmen, they were better suited for just close quarter combat, a bit like in every situation, right? Mass is important, though. And we don't have to forget that the same Macedonian phalanx could actually do back and forth. I mean, why shouldn't they? Right? Yes, it's kind of surely more difficult to maintain the formation by some degree. But at the same time, it's just, again, a heavy infantry line that, by going back and forth, can lose cohesion, can have some problems, just like the Romans could have, right? There are, of course, instances in which there are some broken formation altogether that are able to regroup in some way and striking back. The Romans do this at some point. But we know that at the Battle of Sellasia, the Macedonian pikemen could sometimes recover and go on to win, even after having been pushed back by the enemy. There are battle accounts, like, I don't know, there was an instance, Philip II, his very first battle, if I'm not wrong, at least a large scale, that attacks an enemy uphill with his phalanx, and then he's pushed back by stones, enemy resistance, and the phalanx manages to literally descend back the way it had come and remaining intact, right? So the Macedonian phalanx did work with some important degree of flexibility as well, such as the Battle of Magnesia proves, for example, when they even managed to form a square with elephants in the center, which seemingly was the reason why eventually they they broke, right? Because the elephants got nervous and began to damage the same square. And we're talking about a huge mass of pikemen, right? So their drill was really something, right? I would go as far as that, even the individual combat capabilities of a Macedonian phalangite were not necessarily like nothing in close combat, right? They were equipped, after all, with important weapons, even for such obedience. They were evidently designed to a more comprehensive system. The Roman legionnaire was, again, in that sense, more adaptable. But let's say it wasn't a completely defenseless host, right? You can argue that, yes, maybe the Macedonian phalangite wasn't as aggressive minded like an Italic warrior, but and there are hints about this, but it's the general order of the formation that eventually makes the battle go the way it did, right? Again, all these battles are fundamentally decided by either moral issues explicitly, and or something like an entire chunk of the battle line breaking, or remaining disconnected, or something like that is big, right? We're never told like the Romans or whoever won because they used this weapon rather than another, right? Just stupid people today think that such thing is real, right? It's not the case. We're talking about dramatically homogeneous military cultures by many degree, and especially from a material to technological point of view. What is obvious enough, without even pointing out, for example, Plutarch's Cleomenes 28, comparatively from just what happened in the Middle Ages, that these battle lines, in order not to in fact, hamper each other and causing also dangerous domino effects in case of rout, were distanced in the hundreds of meters. I studied early 14th century warfare, as you know, and the average distance from a battle line to another is 500 meters. So this opens an interesting question regarding the alleged maniples, weapon, and all that thing that we'll not discuss today, and that is purely conjectural in any reconstruction that you can find. And that often is considered like, they were so close. They weren't. The battle lines weren't close at all. And the way they substitute each other may have been much easier than we think. Like in the Middle Ages, you have also these in-depth formations, and you're told decently how the entire battle fared, but nobody tells you how eventually, like a battle line that had won basically gets out of the way when the second arrives, because it doesn't tell you when on was the. I mean, it could happen, but the moment in which they literally, there are two massive battle lines of tens of thousands of men, you can't make them cross each other, right? So they evidently melted away, and in that say dissolved order, they simply could pass even within the gaps between the various units, like Livy says, for example, as we were calling for that for the Battle of Suessa in the 4th century BC, when the Manipular Legion had already been created, because it's kind of obvious, like one battle line is exhausted. Even if they win, they're spent, so you can save them by make them regroup in the rear, and lining them up again is complicated, because that's the main problem at the end of the day. But still, they are there, and they kind of can support in case of total disaster. But we're talking about a general. They're exhausted anyway, so it's not that they can't even help more than much. What they have done is proving, just aside from having inflicted losses to the enemy, but proven there who the stronger is. From a moral point of view, it's a huge deal, because of all the effort, of all the hatred, and all the reason. You realize, oh my God, we made all this effort, and these guys win, right? It's a huge dimension in the economy of moral forces on a battlefield. So it's not even a problem. Again, there is a huge historiography about this which is a non-problem if you had, again, just studied, for example, medieval warfare in parallel to ancient warfare in many ways, because they work the same. So it's obvious that they were the Roman battle lines were spaced in the hundreds of meters. Caesar in the Battle of Gallica, of course, 1:25-26, writes that the Helvetii fell back no less than a mile after getting the worst of the initial clash, before resuming fierce resistance from their new uphill position. How such a withdrawal, just as an example, may have been carried out is impossible to reconstruct precisely. What Caesar describes here seems essentially the break of a battle line with the survivors that, as we've seen, normally were the majority of the troops, aside from the wounded, likely that, however, could still be taken with them. There is an example, for example, in Germanic warfare, the Celts seemingly were much more about the first charge, right, and just eventually falling back crushed because they had spent everything in that thing. It's a bit stereotypical. They actually fought in a more similar way than we think. But in this case, the picture is these guys are broken. They just entrench uphill, and the strategic logic is evident. They have lost the initiative. They just take a defensive position, right? So they have tested that the Romans are stronger, and they just wait for them for a second stand, right? This does happen as well. As we were saying before, there are instances, of course, in which we know pretty clearly how the separation of the battle lines occurred between let's say an engagement and another, right? Of the same battle lines fighting, right? Sometimes things could get disorderly, but it's never like these lines ever, say, losing complete cohesion until they said, okay, it's over for us for the day in the first place. So you could have this even halfways in which, you know, the line breaks and you start pulling back. But of course, the slower you do it and the more the enemy can press on you, and so the more dangerous it becomes. So at some point, yes, even flights for regrouping somewhere else were possible, but there were still routes of some kind. The degree by which you would be able to regroup depends on how morally loaded you are. The fact that the Celts were less cohesive than the Romans, of course, but also the Germans, is proven by the fact that, in fact, in sources like Livy, even from the same Roman side in Caesar, the Gauls are told literally breaking suddenly, turning, running, and then taking another position, right? The Germans instead are often described like, in some cases, also being more of course, even strategically less bold, and so fighting nearby to a fort somewhere they could retreat into a friendly territory, but at least fighting in a more compact way because they were more morally loaded than the Celts, and so even retreating slowly and dragging maintaining the battle line cohesive and dragging the wounded together with them, which was beautiful, frankly, and that's how we properly test also the quality of troops, historical different peoples, different indicators, right? It's definitely possible that, however, the better troops that were in the front, being also the heavier, had more difficulty and kind of less chance to simply turn and flee. So they would probably be the ones who, as we've seen also during the retreats, would stand their ground to the last, right? And even sometimes having no choice, resisting in that way. This is very important because these were the most important elements, the ones in which also the greater political responsibility for the loss eventually would fall, the victory, conversely. So this does make sense from a military logical point of view. Polybius and Appian talk about this as well, so this more gradual retreat from some elements too. Um, and it's not so difficult to think about it also in Roman warfare, frankly. For example, Octavian's soldiers at Philippi are told to have pushed back the enemy's line as though they were revolving a heavy mechanism. And this entails naturally that the Caesaricide legionnaires were, a tough nut to crack. It was doing so, but slowly. And we don't think this has anything to do with any kind of autismos, for example, like in the hoplitic phalanx, when you literally have these two guys pushing, like in a rugby match, quite muscularly speaking. That was important, but it's the formation's aggressiveness and or this feeling of going under that dictates this balance on the battlefield. And it's much more like even distanced as we can presume, right? With maybe just one guy, at some point for saving time or recovering, re-inspiring the others and repassing to the initiative, launches himself alone against the enemy and then pulls back. And we know from some wounds, even in general warfare, that's the most dangerous moment, but it's a hell of a show, and it's part still of that kind of heroic warfare that at the end of the day we can find in earlier and later times here and there. And most of the fight would occur in a sense like this, with a very solid front, that whoever was watching out, whatever was happening, being quite flexible to move on the field. Consider that, of course, especially as far as complex maneuvers are concerned, a battlefield is not a basketball field, so you can't do whatever you want. There are orchards, there are walls, whatever. So it's it's always a matter of taking form on the various grounds that you find sometimes too, and with engagements that are incredibly weird. Like, I don't know, the Romans at some point being attacked in a hospital tent and all the wounded managing to aggress the aggressors and putting them in fight, like this kind of situation. And this suits well the description, of course, of the Roman legionnaire, also from some accounts probably stressing the fact that if properly armed, they could fight everywhere, right? There wasn't like a type of fight that they wouldn't take on. So always consider, as we'll see now, that the Roman legionnaire was not only conceived to be like in a packed formation. I don't even say thickly packed, because we don't even know what the order the Romans normally adopted really were. The only dimensions that we know is from Polybius and Vegetius, that really talk about what could comparably be like an open order and a phalanx-like order, right? There was surely something in between, and that's literally the only two measures that we know in the entire Roman warfare, just to tell you the degree of documentation. We will see these aspects better as far as combat is concerned, because, as you understand, it's very interesting. However, it's clear that there wasn't much of a importance that Romans gave to the depth of the single battle lines. As a matter of fact, this is proven by the fact that Romans often opted for the formation for the array in depth. That is to say, not making a unique battle line like, say, the Macedonians could do, or as also the Romans had done and could do in some situations, of course, but mostly triplinate. But there were different arrangements, especially as the cohort came about, right? Everything was much more composable, as you know, and we don't really know. There were different types of arrays, but these were, of course, deployed depending on the circumstance. There could be, of course, an increase in the depth of the lines, in fact, the main fighting formation. Like in hoplitic warfare, just to understand, it was just 8, right? And this depends on the terrain, it depends on the space, literally, that you have or what you want to do, because actually the concept of an in-depth formation, as you understand, if you change the order of the elements, the result is the same mathematically. And if you want to triple the depth of your formation, you have necessarily to narrow the front. So it's not, as I was saying at the beginning, something you can always make, or that by default you would in any situation. And it depends on so many different factors, and that's why we sometimes get a bit too stereotypically the idea that the world is finding the same way. There are also pros and cons, as you understand, because it doesn't matter. The reserves are quite important. We have described the what's the purpose of reserves in the von Clausewitz series. The freshness, especially of these other units, once the other are spent, is sometimes decisive, right? But mathematically it doesn't explain it, because you're simply also sending less troops to fight, and at the end of the day, if also the enemy fights the same way as you still parallel the two things. So there are two reasons why this normally happens. It's a matter of control of the army in a way, because the engagement is longer. You have this order, right? You may not know up to which point this is gonna end. There are chances to retreat with some intact forces from the battlefield if things go wrong in the first two lines, battle lines, of course. And there is also probably a cultural reason for this, that is to say, more aggressive armies tend to be deployed more in depth, right? Sometimes you have, again, even a problem of order, of formation, etc. The barbarians, for example, didn't have, as far as we know, particularly interactive battle lines, even though they, of course, knew how to fight like that in some instances, but there wasn't properly much of a sense of internal gradation, right? The societies were more homogeneous, and the battle line could reflect, even in the case of the Celts, this necessity of just, even because, for example, they didn't have a particularly developed logistics, they had just to attack in one shot, tactically as strategically sometimes. But the idea is that the more aggressive you are, and the more you count on breaking, of course, in the first shot, and so if you're doing so, but you can also dose those forces in a more effective way, as it's mostly the first ranks that do the thing, right? The Altis Moss allows you to push literally, like in a rugby, fashion. But if you are, again, a much more aggressively loaded individual, like this, even a legionnaire could be, you wanna essentially stem the same same impetus initially, so that you have other lines in the rear. For example, why did cavalry, medieval armies in the 13th century developed in depth in three lines? Because cavalry was very punching, and so rather than risking all in one single line, or different battles but in a single line in the front, you would just make this battle lines succeed each other one after the other in combat in the aforementioned way, which is exactly what the Romans do with infantry, though. So this is a debated topic, and I'm not going to provide you just with that explanation, but I can't even digress on it for it today, so we'll see it at another point. But consider this when you think about the Roman mentality compared, say, to the Hoplitic one. It was essentially an amatorial one designed to minimize even probably any, let's say, protracted engagement, because these guys were not professionals of war, with the usual exception of the Spartans. That confirms the rule, right? This doesn't even mean that Hoplitic combat is less bloody, because we've seen basically the losses in percentage are the same, and also this is a single line, so even the ones in the front are really, are not alternating, or better succeeding each other, because this sense of alternation can be misleading even for the Roman army. So the point concretely being that even the hoplites were actually pretty much more dirty-handed, bloody-handed than you think. Um, the the prototype for, let's say, an average guy living in classical but also Hellenistic Greece as a concept was being a psychopathic serial killer like Achilles, right? The idea of literally throwing yourself against the enemy and chopping him to pieces and showing off in front of the battle lines is what actually even every reenactor would easily tell you anyone can do. If you make an ape angry, that's exactly what they're going to do. There's no merit in being just one that spends all his exhausts itself immediately in a combat that has no logical sense. What it means to be disciplined and what it means to be an actual killing machine, like the professional military really is to contain those forces and striking only at the right moment. What it means to undergo the Roman military training means being brutally, traumatically, probably destroyed as a human being and transformed as a purely slaughtering machine, which has nothing to do with, of course, just the most ridiculous things we see today. Well, kids thinking that, making HEMA has anything to do with any actual warfare, and even pretending that, because when showed with the evidence that has nothing to do with it, and being even just an average guy from a 5th century BC Hellenic polis that has a much less modern and secular mindset than you and is already habituated to that, and to physical exertion to a much greater extent than you are. You don't want to know what being a Romano-Italic legionnaire actually is, and from which background, and what happened to you to get there, right? These are things, for not talking about what it means to be a Germanic warrior in that sense. The difference is, however, that, again, there is a professional military that develops on the base of a systematic subjugation that proves this dramatic moral load, like in the Roman Empire is the case, that subdues the warrior individualism, whichever it is, and that just starts, because it's so stronger than it, that it starts molding it under its own discipline. And this tells you probably the might of armies like, let's say, the Macedonian, or especially the Roman one. And it tells you why it was these guys that actually conquered the world, not somebody else. Right? You can be hyper individually loaded, but not really accomplishing a great much collectively. You can be a hybrid between the two things, and that's basically what Rome becomes, and this explains a lot actually about the same Roman culture and civilization. So you cannot compare literally everything, at least to make an equivalence of the same. Right, this is the point we're making. There are other factors. There are big ones and overlap, and you often don't see if you just reason mechanically, right? Or especially if you reason individually. If you reason individually, you have already lost. And that's what they don't teach you. Of course, nor train you in gyms where they make you, dress up like a, let's not say what exactly. In any case, the Romans were able also to take on enemies that had an important amount of ranks depth. Part of the reason is that, of course, not all the enemies can fight in that moment. They have just a single line, and most of the engagement is from the frontal ranks, right? So when you look at the Seleucid phalanx at Magnesia being no less than 32 ranks deep, you realize that when the Romans took on, say, the equivalent or something similar, at least in depth, to in the Pyrrhic Wars, you're literally told that, for example, they didn't want to battle the elephants, so they preferred to throw themselves among the Macedonian pikes and trying to kill as many enemies as possible in that way, as quickly as possible, which is very interesting. It tells you that, of course,
it was normal to come to hand with a Macedonian phalangite, even if he had an important, just some meters long spear, so not even just this dramatic obstacle, right, but still being functional to successfully not making the Romans breaking through frontally, which tells you that both sides suffered losses, and that's why they engaged each other. And was again the fist, scissor, and paper thing doesn't make any sense, because otherwise they would have simply not fought. They would have determined that nobody could break the phalangites frontally, and that's it, right? It's not the case either, because they could inflict losses. It's just like World War the First. Why do you think there were all those frontal attacks against trenches? Because generals were stupid. More likely that you are stupid if you think something like that. Just take in consideration how many losses there were from the other side too, and how many men you needed to pin there just to stop those attacks, and then you have the logic of World War the First, that if you didn't get as an adult, is a pretty disturbing thing regarding properly your mental capacities. But this applies sadly to most people. The Romans too could deepen their own ranks. By the way, we'll talk about this aspect in another video, but in Africa in 255 BC against the Carthaginians trained by Xanthippus, and during the Second Punic War even against Hannibal at Cannae, where the Romans, as you know, deepened the ranks exactly because they wanted to break through a sort of push the same Carthaginian line, and thus entering the Carthaginian trap, but at the same time actually making a sensible choice, right? If you wanted to defeat Hannibal, you had to deploy that deep, right? So the point even there is not what kind of thing Hannibal had in mind, but whether his troops could perform that, by which degree. And he didn't know it in advance, nor the Romans were completely unaware of what was happening, of course. And that's instead what, again, most people really see military logic in a distorted way like, right? The Roman array at Cannae wasn't bad. It wasn't bad because it fell in the Carthaginian trap, because the Carthaginian trap requires a certain strength. If that strength is not there, it fails. It's all lost. From the other side as well. This deepening of the formation also has barely to do with, say, comparisons like, for example, Epaminondas at Leuctra, right? That was designed exactly to actually prevent the Spartans to deploy in time, which was the advantage of the Spartans, because they trained all the time and had that edge, right? Also to move on the battlefield more quickly than the enemies. And Epaminondas uses mass in that regard, and some kind of different equipment to facilitate the operation. But this was not Hannibal's case, also considering that, again, basically the Greeks had an asymmetry in the battle line. They favored one of the wings, whereas other peoples were more warlike, and so they just attacked all frontally. The Romans had everything symmetric, the Carthaginians fundamentally too, the Celts, etc. Like, it's not that was the normality, rather. And that tells you that concept of the more direct aggressiveness. It's something more mediated, like the Hellenic military culture had somehow developed from their side in comparison. We don't see also much success deriving from the deepening of the single battle line, nor against the Romans from a foreign perspective. I mean, look at what the Romans did against the Macedonian phalanxes, but not even between Romans. For example, at Pharsalus, Caesar's formations were much shallower than Pompey's 10 men deep lines, right? So as Caesar himself said in Frontinus' report, this again could be just sometimes we don't know with precision, but we could also calculate considering the depletion of the various legions were often under strength, especially in Caesar's case at that point. So it wouldn't be strange, because you also have to fight basically with the same frontal width that, again, as we were saying before, very often dictates whether you can use even different lines or not, right? It's not really a matter of preference there, because otherwise you're outflanked, just like eventually Pompey did, but was fooled by Caesar into that had, as you know, hidden some infantry force actually to stem this Pompeian success against the Caesarian flank, the left. So you see how it's a matter, again, literally of forces rather than any specific geometric consideration. It's obvious that the Roman legionnaire was trained to maintain an important order even in the chaos of battle, right? It was the most important thing for any unit, maintaining cohesion, importantly enough, right? But it's a broader cohesion, right, by some standard. And always remember, these soldiers were quite sometimes even, individualistic, albeit disciplined, right? So think about Pudlo and Varenus in Caesar in that Alpine engagement. It's pretty indicative of how much the same Caesar was actually saying, look at this, man, they're crazy. They're selling forth from the camp with a notion of Gallic enemies in front of them, but they say each other as competitors that they were, and they managed to come back in the camp and exalting the morale. So this was very important in Roman culture, because they were actually very exalted in this kind of virtus, as we were talking about yesterday, next to discipline, right? And there is some interesting comparison even in the same within the same Roman literature that could be drawn to the standards which this had been true. Important was the result ultimately where the Imperium manifested. So it was crucial, but still it's a very different mentality in the 1st century BC from, say, the one of the 4th century BC. And it was always sometimes a matter of political struggle, what kind of model you wanted for your own troops. Caesar had to be a bit more popular because of his political plans, so that was also a way to exalt, for example, the centurions that otherwise an average senator would have not given a damn about, at least in for the sake of who was actually the medium with the Imperium, so the commander in chief. But this is another issue. But remember that it's even just if it helps you mentally to consider the Romans in this more like chivalric way, well, know that it helps you also reducing a bit that mechanicism and technologism that you think you've been told that the Romans were all about, right? This is nothing, of course, subtracted to the Roman legionnaire who was primarily an assault engineer. There could be different ways, naturally, of deepening the formation. One was, as we've seen, increasing the number of battle lines in the typical mid-republican framework of triplex Accius, so the Astati, the Principes, and the Triarii, or let's say simply modifying the unit formation, right, within the same battle line, right? The cohort tended to be deeper at some point, as we understand. We're not entirely sure about it, telling the truth. We just know that in that time of Polybius Caesar, because cohorts appear actually since the end of the Second Punic War, and who knows even whether before maybe they had been experimenting something. It's not probably done so in such a relevant way, but no, they weren't invented by Marius. Just in Caesar's times, however, they were able to change formation much more quickly because they were just fully professional soldiers. In some cases, also grizzled veterans, so they knew perfectly how to move collectively on the field. There are too many issues about this. Perhaps it was wrong just to step into the topic because I leave you with too much untold eventually, but we'll see this stuff at another point. In any case, the multiple battle lines were employed also with different combinations, right, for carrying out different maneuvers tactically. For example, the Battle of the Metaurus River, you have literally a wheeling maneuver. At the Great Plains, also something, right, but it's symmetrical this time. The same at Zama. So Nero, Scipio, during the Second Punic War, Brink, of course, the Manipular Legion that had that triple fact order, but was essentially frontally conceived to engage just frontally to some other horizons, right? And this, strangely enough, but not so much if you think about the different degree of involvement compared to the Second Punic War, disappears in the 2nd century BC when we do not really find similar maneuvers carried out, like the degree Scipio had carried out again at the Great Plains, etc. At Kynoskephali, the Second Battle of Chaeronea and Pharsalus, however, we see, so across a time that stretches from still the Polybian Manipular Legion to the civil wars, the cohort, the post-Marian cohort, you see, of course, an important amount of combinations, right? And the primary reason for this all, however, still remains having reserves, right? Fresh troops to, I don't think necessarily to replace or to reinforce a specific battle line, but just simply being used as reserves, right, in a gradual effort during the battle. So we don't have to necessarily think a century or a maniple, because maniples kept existing even during cohortal times, being necessarily individually replaced, right, from a battle line to another. Who knows, within the same cohort, like this is all conjectural, we don't know anything about this literally. But rather, as far as the broader battle lines were concerned, just like, as we were saying before, a battle line is crushed or exhausted, it dissolves, regroups behind the wall array, and the next line goes, right? So Livy, as we were saying before, describes this for the early Manipular Legion in the late 4th century BC, right, on the base of other, of course, of traditions. We don't have to think Livy knew exactly what he was describing there, but it's pretty normal, also on the base of what probably he knew about his own times. Caesar speaks of fresh cohorts replacing tired ones at Ilerda and Pharsalus, interestingly enough. And ancient authors are actually pretty explicit about the advantage of a fresh reserve, which gave the Romans an edge over the enemies, right? Even in equal or greater numbers, as it often happened actually in the case of Roman troops. This is not just it, right? The idea of having a reserve is a universal one in the military art. It was not a Roman thing only. The point is, how could the Romans organize this? How could they make essentially the equivalent of a single battle line, essentially 3 battle lines with the same homogeneous degree of combativeness, which was not the case even in the Macedonian single battle line, and also in the simple ones that other peoples used, because they literally didn't have that degree of order that they could maintain so easily. If you study how, let's say, the Celts, for example, arrayed their troops, they just came on the battlefield and etc. You don't have to give for granted there was much order on a regular basis, right? It all depended on the leader, on the possibilities, on what kind of these groups also had negotiated before. The Romans were something else, right? Statally, politically, socially, so they could afford, again, the creation of a true professional military with a degree of homogeneity that by the time of Marius is self-evident. But that also before was really, had an important degree of the same. So this is as we've seen, not just necessarily something just for the soldier per se, but also for the ability of commanding large amounts of troops more orderly and with a degree of, say, a balance between the unit of command, simplicity, also combined arms, and so on, right? Today, again, we don't talk about cavalry, but that was also important. Today, we also do not talk about the so-called checkerboard deployment, which is also too much, of a nuisance. Nobody knows how it really was, and there is no way to assess it, notoriously. Maniple swapping, these alleged gaps that existed, it's more like a problem because, say, at a point you find it written as an agmen, and you understand that there are also necessities regarding what was used. See, agmen is the formation of the army in March, right? And Achius is the one deployed for battle. So it's two different things, and you shouldn't toy too much with the idea of what kind of formation the Romans used was different from the others, but because it likely wasn't that much, right? The maniples were probably very close to each other without de facto leaving an equivalent maniple space in between them, as much as they could be at some point, but we don't know the logic of it or how this served any tactical purpose in practice, especially in terms of maniple swapping, etc. The idea of punching the enemy battle line in different points at a time also, frankly, doesn't sound necessarily like what could have been done by these units as opposed to a continuous front line, right? So it's let's not talk about this today. But to summarize, Roman heavy infantry engagements possessed some clear characteristics. The battles could drag on for an hour or more before being decided. Right, there could be different engagements throughout the whole this several hours long confrontations. The losers against a Roman legion suffered a bloody amount of losses, a higher one than, say, comparatively to the Hoplitic classical phalanx, but for obvious reasons, considering the times and places. That we use it comparatively just because we have some data now about that, say, more thoroughly analyzed. Studying all Hellenistic battles is also quite complex, but we will get there. We know, of course, that the battle lines were spaced with hundreds of meters in between. They probably just dissolved when they were exhausted or broken, and retreated behind the last ones existing. So there wasn't, in my opinion, any greater deal of interaction, especially at close range between the battle lines. I never seen it, right, in any other context. So why should it be there if not the fact that you may have not studied other contexts other than this? And there was a general, say, moral dimension to properly the cultural background of the Roman army that made these infantrymen more aggressive, more suitable to different types of combat, and generally speaking habituated to, in fact, and eager to take on the enemy in that more individual way that even the tripartition of the battle line could embody in a way or another, because it would give the chance to different strata of this world army to fight at some point in first line, and with a full force that you could spend from these still semi-barbarian background that was already disciplined enough to remain in that order during the battle, and then say the single Macedonian battle line, where basically the guys in the rear were not even meant to engage most of it, especially if they were particularly deep ranks, even though of course even about those we don't have to believe they were necessarily like harmless or just even innocuous in close combat, just as the equipment were not radically different, right? A coppice could be used by these troops, and yes, the Roman legionnaire was better equipped at close quarters, but it's mostly its mindset that had made the equipment, not much the fact that Macedonian soldier couldn't or wouldn't be able to engage in hand-to-hand combat with some effectiveness, right? It's the broader logical deformation, the brutal traumatic impact of breaking what the unity of that phalangitic battle line really embodies for the system, the combined arms of the phalanx, considering the cavalry together with it. And it shows in this sense how more primitively brutal the Romans were, and so directly frontally aggressive without too many other issues. Alright, and so we will surely deepen all these topics in other dedicated videos. For today I stop it here. However, I just hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it, otherwise leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming content. As always, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time. Bye.